How much of a problem is cancer globally? What are the sort of headline statistics on the macro view of cancer for someone that really doesn't know?
Yeah, well, it's getting worse. I can't say there. It's in the millions. I know precisely what's going on in this country because the American Cancer Society every year distributes the data on cancer. We have almost 2 million new cases diagnosed per year in the United States. And we have 1,700 people a day dying from cancer in the United States, which comes to about 70 people per hour in the United States. Now, when I went to China, I looked at some numbers there, and it was 8,000 people a day are dying from cancer. Obviously, the population is so much larger. And I don't know what it is in the UK. I mean, we'd have to go to their cancer registries. But what we do know is that it's supposed to be a lot worse by 2050 than it is today. So there seems to be no reduction in deaths, suffering for this disease. And I can speak to the reasons for that. But right now, I would say it's a global epidemic of cancer. It's not getting better. It's getting worse. More people are dying from it. There's no major advance in reducing death rates. So it's a great tragedy. And when we understand what's causing it and what we're not doing to prevent it or treat it, it'll be recognized as the singular greatest tragedy in the history of medicine worldwide. When they come to know what I know about this disorder, and then they realize what we've been doing in a misdirected way, it'll be recognized as the greatest tragedy in the history of medicine.
What types of cancer are people dying from? What is the most popular types of cancer for men and women?
Well, it's always been lung cancer, pretty much for men and women. Lung cancer has always been the number one, but we have pancreatic, breast cancer, colon cancer. These are all on the rise. Colon cancer is on the rise. Pancreatic cancer is on the rise in this country. I can't speak for other countries. They may vary slightly due to diet and lifestyle issues, but lung cancer has always been recognized as the number one cancer.
How many people in the United States then, based on the statistics, would develop cancer?
Well, it seems to increase every year, so it's kind of a moving target. It doesn't seem to go down. You know, what it is today, I don't know, but what I do know is the numbers of people that are dying each day, because the American Cancer Society comes out with, I think it's 612,000 people will die this year, 2024, from cancer in this year. So divide it by 365, and it comes out to just about 1,700 people a day. Divide that number by 24, and you get about 70 people an hour, based on the numbers provided to us from the American Cancer Society. When they say we've made major advances in cancer incidences, right? So in the 1990s, they instituted the anti-smoking campaigns, all right? So today, if you read, they say we have reduced cancer deaths by 31 or 32%. Wow, that sounds really impressive. So what they do is they take the number. This is what the American Cancer Society has done, and it's published in their papers. Okay, if we didn't stop smoking in the 90s and everybody continued to smoke, the trajectory would be very, very high. Because we stopped smoking, we have 33% lower death than if we didn't stop smoking. But the trajectory is continuing to increase, maybe not as steep as it would have been had we continued to smoke. So it was clearly a prevention. It had nothing to do with a treatment. It had to do with prevention that was giving we've made major advances in reducing cancer death rate. Yeah, because people stopped smoking. For many, many people, more people would have died had they not smoked. So we have people that are not real people. We're just looking at what would have happened if we didn't stop smoking.
What are the leading causes of death worldwide in terms of diseases? I hear that heart disease is number one.
I think heart disease is number one. Cancer is number two.
Okay. And there are many different types of cancer, right? I heard there's hundreds of different forms of cancer.
If you look under the electron microscope, or even a light microscope, this is how most cancers are diagnosed by light microscopy. You look under the microscope and you see a bunch of cells that are dysmorphic in the way they look, and then they all have genetic defects and all this kind of stuff. But they all have one thing in common. They depend on a fermentation, energy without oxygen. So all cancers are a singular type of disease. It's just that they happen in different tissues. But when you look at the underlying problem, they're all very, very similar. They can't live without a fermentation, which means energy without oxygen. So that's the common pathophysiological problem in all cancers, whether it's a colon, brain, breast, bladder, skin, lung. We've looked at all these cancers, and they're all essentially using the same mechanism to grow out of control.
So what is that fermentation you mentioned?
Fermentation is energy without oxygen.
What does that mean?
We breathe air, and we exhale CO2 and water vapor. And those are the waste products of the food that we eat. Everything is broken down and combusted in our mitochondria of the cell. And the waste products are CO2 and water vapors. Those are the waste products. But if you and I were to stop breathing for any particular time period, our bodies would fill up with lactic acid and succinic acid, like if we were to have a heart attack or when somebody has a heart attack. They don't die instantly. If they're there for 5 or 7 minutes without oxygen, they may die because the brain dies. But if you can get the heart to beat again and get oxygen back in the system, you can come alive again. But when we have that massive interruption of oxygen into our body, the cells fall back on an ancient, they immediately turn on these ancient pathways to get energy without oxygen for a short period of time. And that's the sugar glucose, which is already in our bloodstream from the food we eat, and the amino acid glutamine, which is an amino acid in our bloodstreams. Highest level of amino acid is the glutamine. These two fuels are now burned for energy, obtain energy without oxygen. These pathways upregulate, and you can get ATP, which is energy, to keep you alive for a short period of time. But your bloodstream is filling up with the waste products called lactic acid and succinic acid. Lactic acid is coming from glucose, the sugar, and succinic acid is coming from the amino acid glutamine. And they build up, and that tells you you're fermenting. You're getting energy without oxygen because you're not breathing. Very simple. You're not breathing, but I'm not dead yet. Now, of course, if you don't get it for very long, you die. It's just that. Now, the other way you can stop oxygenation in our bodies quickly is with the poison cyanide. So if we, God forbid, we were to take cyanide, we'd be both dead within a minute. We just because our bodies are completely shut down of energy from oxygen. Now, here's the cancer cell. The cancer cell can live in cyanide. The cyanide does not kill a tumor. Okay, Otto Warburg showed this a long time ago, and we've also shown the same thing in our lab. Others have shown this. The interesting thing is when you look at cancer cells, even in the presence of oxygen, even in oxygen, they're throwing out lactic acid and succinic acid. What does that mean? That means the organelle inside the cell that generates energy is not efficient. It's inefficient. And the cells are using ancient fermentation. And when I say ancient fermentation, you have to realize the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. The organisms that existed on our planet 2.5 billion years ago were all fermenters. There was no oxygen in the atmosphere until the photosynthetic bacteria started making oxygen. There were living cells. They had no oxygen. And they were growing like crazy, unregulated growth, just unregulated. What's going on here? And they would die as soon as the fermentable fuels were dissipated. As they gobbled up everything, they would just die. So they lived as long as they could reproduce and have fermentation fuels. The cancer cell in our body is doing nothing than falling back on these ancient fermentation pathways that become accelerated, upregulated in the tumor cell because the efficiency of the energy coming from the mitochondria is now depleted. It's defective in many different ways. So this is very clear. And this happens in lung cancer, colon cancer. We've looked at all the major cancers, and we found out these common defects are seen in all the cancers. So they're all very similar in their metabolism. They're very different in what they look like under the microscope. Lung doesn't look like colon, doesn't look like brain. They're very different genetically. They're all different from each other, but they're all common in a dependency on this ancient pathway of energy metabolism.
Can you take me back? You mentioned a guy called Warburg there?
Yeah.
Can you take me back on the journey that the scientific community, or at least you have been on, to arrive at the conclusion that the central sort of causal factor, or at least an indication of the causal factor of cancer, lies in this shift in energy systems. Where did this understanding start in research?
Well, it started with Otto Warburg for sure in the 1920s. The other linkage, before I tell you what Otto Warburg did, because I was like everybody else, I thought cancer was a genetic disease, and I heard about Warburg, didn't really know what he was talking about or invested any time thinking about what he said. But Linda Nebling was a PhD nursing student at Case Western Reserve University in Ohio. And she took these two little hopeless kids, brain cancer. We call hopeless cases when they have no predictability of long-term survival. And she gave them a ketogenic diet to lower blood sugar. And she was able to rescue these kids. One eventually died. The other one was lost to follow-up. And she said her strategy was based on what Otto Warburg had said about glucose and cancer. So then I said, Warburg. I said, who the hell? Let me go back and check out who this guy was and what he did, because I was seeing similar things in the mouse with that drug. It was lowering glucose, and we were shrinking these tumor cells. And we published a paper, one of the first ever papers, linking that how high your blood sugar is determines how fast your tumor will grow in the mice. And now how this has been replicated in all human cancers. The higher your blood sugar, the faster the tumor grows. The lower the blood sugar, the slower the tumor grows. Undeniable for all different human mouse cancers. Wow. So Warburg had said this a long time ago, back in the 1920s. He was taking slices of all kinds of human and rat, mouse tumors and slicing them up. And he noticed something really strange about these cancers. They take in less oxygen compared to the normal tissue from which they came. Wow, so they're kind of like oxygen deprived. And they were throwing out this lactic acid waste product that he was saying. And they were taking in so much more glucose than the normal. So the normal cells take in just a little bit of glucose and they can make tremendous energy from a tiny amount. This guy was taking in huge amounts of glucose, but not fully metabolizing it to CO2 and water, but dumping it out as lactic acid, which is a breakdown product of glucose that is not fully metabolized in the cell. Wow, he said, this is unbelievable. And then he did all kinds of tissue. I looked at his data. It was unbelievable. He was cutting humans, mice, rats, and seeing the same thing over and over again. And he was saying the origin of cancer has to do with something in the ability of the mitochondrion, the organelle, to generate efficient energy from oxygen.
So the mitochondria is the part of the cell that creates energy.
It's the part of the cell that creates energy through oxidative phosphorylation, which is burning energy using oxygen, okay?
Okay, so it's like an engine.
It's an engine, a very highly efficient engine. This is an organelle. You have to realize we have the cell,
yeah,
and we have a nucleus that everybody knows about, this nucleus. And then we have all these little organelles in there. We have lysosomes, and we have the mitochondrion, which is like a spaghetti network inside the cell. They fuse. It's actually a second living organism inside our cells.
And to simplify what they do, the mitochondria, they convert oxygen and glucose into energy?
Yes, and they combust energy. They take the foods that we eat have carbon-hydrogen bonds, okay? And we break those down inside our mitochondria. And when we break those bonds down, we create a hydrogen gradient, and we dissipate that gradient through an impeller mechanism that generates energy like crazy. It's unbelievable. Very efficient, highly efficient. But the cancer cell has corruption in that system. But it doesn't happen overnight. As Warburg said, if you break that system too acutely and too fast, the cell will die. It doesn't have so you have to have two things to get from oxidative phosphorylation to energy with minimal oxygen fermentation.
Sorry, just to keep it simple, from a normal cell to a cancerous cell.
From a normal cell to a cancer cell doesn't happen overnight.
Okay.
It's a chronic damage to the ability of that organelle inside the cell to generate efficient energy. Okay, so all we have to know with cancer is that how are they growing so rapidly? Why are they going out of control? How come it's so hard to kill them? Because as long as you have those fermentable fuels that drive this ancient fermentation pathway, they will continue to grow. They're very hard to kill.